So as we head to the war's anniversary, nearly 2 years now, what is the state of play for the conflict at this point?
Well, at this point, the situation is we are seeing, especially over the last week, an intensification of aerial attacks. It all started last week with Ukraine basically destroying a landing ship that Russia had in Crimea, in an eastern port of Barrage. And since then, the attacks have been relentless, and there's a bit of a tit for tat in terms of aerial attacks, in terms of drone attacks. So last week we saw the biggest missile attack that Russia has conducted against targets, especially residential targets and civilian targets across Ukraine. One of the missiles actually strayed into Poland for 3 minutes. Then we saw another attack. This time, it was Russia. It was apparently Ukraine attacking a city next to the border on the Russian side, also killing people. And we're seeing more and more. There's a fresh attack right now, just now happening on Kyiv, and 10 people are injured. A large part of the city is without water and electricity. So there's a lot of aerial attacks. At the same time, on the ground, what we're seeing is that for the past few months, there's basically a stalemate. There's very little movement in terms of troops, and a lot is actually happening in the air. But we're not anywhere closer to any kind of resolution. Although last week, or earlier this week, actually, President Vladimir Putin said he's ready for talks. He's ready for peace talks, but on his terms, which basically means we don't know what that means actually, but if he controls about 20% of the land territory of Ukraine, and Ukraine saying, well, they are not going to give up an inch, there's very little in terms of the chance for any kind of resolution going forward at this point.
Piotr, good morning. As you're kind of making very clear, there's no abatement in the conflict overall. In fact, there's been a little bit of an escalation short term. However, the dynamics in the geopolitical front is that aid from both the EU and the US has been recently blocked due to political disagreements. Is there likelihood of any kind of the resumption of that aid at any point soon?
Yeah, so at this point, what we're seeing is that essentially Ukraine has been signaling that they have money left for more or less 2 months, right? And in terms of, as you said, in terms of the money that's outstanding and is blocked is about $110 billion in terms of aid coming from the EU and the US. Now, the EU has already set the date for their next European Council, which is on the 1st of February, and they expect to find some kind of a solution. What we know is that obviously Hungary is the one country that's blocking an agreement on what's more than 50 billion euros in terms of aid over 4 years. So there's a likelihood that EU will find some kind of an alternative plan that sort of circumvents Hungary. And Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orban has said he's practically open to that solution. So some kind of funds are going to come quite soon. At the same time, obviously, the situation that Ukraine is in is very dire in terms of financing. They still need about $37 billion in terms of aid just this year. And the big question is, okay, so what happens to the money that's coming from the US? When is the time when Congress reaches some kind of an agreement on their aid package? So there's a lot of uncertainty around the financing, and that obviously doesn't really help in terms of the progress and in terms of sort of supporting Ukraine, especially that in terms of weapons, there's very little coming as well at this point, as the stocks of the weapons, of the supplies that West has been providing is basically depleted, especially in Western Europe. So we're in a very tough situation in terms of help for Ukraine and in terms of financing at this point.